Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron Kepley, with the director of the Rowan Museum. This is Dr. Gary Fries, recently retired from Catawba College. We are here at the Old Stone House in the kitchen, and we thought we would add to the reunion a little bit by having a conversation about German Rowan County history from the Old Stone House. So we're just going to kind of talk to each other about things that we know and things that we think you guys would like to know. So where do we want to start, Dr. Fries?
Well, Aaron, I think we need to start with the year 1747. That's the year that Governor Arthur Dobbs of North Carolina said was the year that Germans began to cross the Yadkin River, and they began to settle in the area between the Yadkin and the Catawba rivers. And I tend to take that as a very accurate date based upon the early land deeds we have, particularly in Rowan County. So I think 1747 helps us understand a few things about why Germans in particular came here and why it would be that year that they would come. So let me start. Let's think about this a little bit.
Sure.
And that is, of course, in 1747, you had a generation and a half of settlement back in Pennsylvania. You had Germans coming since the 1690s to what was called Germantown, and they had begun to come in greater numbers in the early 1700s when they began to go away from the Palatinate and seek refuge in Pennsylvania, which practiced, of course, a religious freedom as well as an economic freedom that was better than most places on earth. And so Germans are there in Pennsylvania, and they're doing quite well. That's one reason that here at the Stone House, we celebrate the style of this house, because it imitates, very strongly imitates, our memories and our ideas of what Pennsylvania Dutch life is like. So Germans are doing that, and I think that they're doing it quite well until about the 1730s, when you get to the third generation of people who are coming over from Germany.
Which, interestingly, 1735 is when Michael and his family come over.
And so Michael Braun, of course, fits our theory in terms of what we think we want to talk about. And I think what had happened is simply a matter of real estate. That by the 1740s, you had essentially a land rush into the hitherlands of Pennsylvania, but you couldn't go that far west because you faced two obstacles. The first was mountains, and the second were Iroquois. Both, of course, were lethal, and both, of course, were, in a sense, dangerous not only to your health, but to your livelihood. And so one of the things we have to consider is that, did Germans come south here, and did they stay here because they wanted to replicate the good kind of life they had in Pennsylvania? That's one reason, again, we are fascinated by this house being built in 1766, because it just immediately brings to mind a kind of quality of colonial life that we admire as Americans. And so I think 1747 is a great departure date because we know that there were tensions on the frontier. We know that there were tensions within the Pennsylvania politics of the day. And we know that people were piling all the way down the Great Valley, down into the Carolinas, to find cheap and good land.
So when you look at the Brown family, Michael, his dad Stephen, his brother Jacob, and Abraham, they all come down here. I think Michael is one of the earliest of them in 1756 or 57. You're looking at the landscape and what's going on. Then you brought up the Iroquois and the mountains of Pennsylvania kind of being that barrier. You also have the very real legal barrier of the Proclamation Line of 1763.
That will come about and be very important.
Yes. So, he is moving during the French and Indian War down here to Rowan County.
Yeah.
And, Rowan County would have been 3 years old whenever he comes here. And, of course, he didn't immediately build a stone house. He more than likely lived in a log cabin for a while he built a stone house.
And we have to consider, why didn't someone of this quality, because we have to consider him a person of quality given what his products were. Why did a person of this quality not stay in Virginia?
That's very
because,
true.
You go up there, you drive Interstate 81 or Old Highway 11, and you look at the beauty of that place, the Shenandoah Valley, and you think, why didn't everyone stay there? Because that was an amazing place to live. The grass was good, the hillsides were good, the soil was fertile, and very importantly, they clearly saw an advantage by being close to the rivers that would take them back to the ports of Virginia and Maryland and even possibly back to Philadelphia. So one of the things you have to ask is, why did Michael Braun come here? And I think, Aaron, you've hit upon it, and I think that the French and Indian War is very much on the minds of these people. Because the more you go back up into Virginia to what was called the Warrior's Path, which was the path that, remember that the Iroquois and the Seneca in particular took to fight the Catawba, and that's sort of a forerunner of the Great Wagon Road, that you have to assume that Braun stopped here because it was like Goldilocks. He had found where the porridge was the best moderation. And I suspect there was something to that.
Gotcha. Well, so what was Rowan County like in those early days? Like, what was Salisbury like? And so you have this new. Michael came to America when he was 5 years old, so he has grown up bilingual more than likely in Pennsylvania.
Very likely, very likely.
And so, what's it like coming into Salisbury in 1756, 57?
Well, the first thing you have to do is divest yourself of the love of red clay. That when we come here to the stone house and we see the gullies that essentially are the products of settlement, we have to assume that the people who came here in the 1750s didn't see it that way, because they didn't see as much of the red clay, because we've come to the opinion that the topsoil was perhaps 2 to 3, possibly even 4 feet thick, and that it was the product of centuries, if not millennia, of natural processes which had culminated in a very mature type of landscape that was pretty much prairie grass mixed with hardwood forest. We know, according to tradition, particularly among the first Presbyterian settlers down here, that they found big and good grassland. Mm-hmm. And we know that grassland had an advantage in several ways. First, you didn't have to cut down the trees everywhere. Mm-hmm. So the labor to establish a life was lessened here. Secondly, I think it's very important to understand that grassland meant cheap food. It meant not only game in abundance, but it meant that your cattle, your hogs, etc., would have the run of the land, would be able to essentially subsist on their own, and you could, in a sense, create a kind of abundant agricultural life without particularly a lot of effort. I think that helps us understand why this house is not at the top of the hill.
Gotcha.
That I often point out to folks around here, not just with this house, but with some others, that what you're establishing is a house that's just above the floodplain, just above the 100-year flood, because you want to be as close to your water line as you can for the nearby spring that you can find. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you don't need to be on the top of the hill, because that's where your cattle pastured, or over time, that's where you planted your grain. So I like to imagine when I'm here that what you saw here was the very logical reasoning that a slope meant that you were close to what you wanted. It also meant drainage. And here we're sitting today, by the way, at Hurricane Sally. And the idea of drainage is an appealing one today. And so we see, I think, that Braun knew what he was doing when he came here, when he built this house. And I think this was writ large across Rowan. I think everyone who had anything, and it was very easy to have something then. You could get a land grant from Lord Granville. I think everyone saw very quickly that this was a place that you could overcome disadvantages, like not having a port. Mm-hmm. So you have to keep in mind, everyone has to keep in mind who comes to the stone house, how did he have enough money, but he didn't live near a city?
Yeah, I mean, Salisbury is built way far off the Yadkin River, and of course the Yadkin River is not navigable above Cheraw.
And when he arrives, the best description we have of Salisbury is that it had 8 or 10 houses. Yeah. And so there, although almost every one of those houses was a business as well as something else, it included a tannery, it included a brewery, it included all kinds of taverns and inns. You have to assume that he and others saw here potential that was willing to walk for. Because you have to remember, if you went trading distance-wise, if you went you could go as far as Philadelphia from here. You
Of
could go
course,
all the way back, which is a long way.
but they often did because
often
that's where
did.
they had the connections. Yeah.
They had the connections. We have to think he had the connections. And I think that that's one of the key things to understand when you really think, how did he do this?
Yeah, I mean that's one thing that I always think about. I often come down here to write grants and things like that. Whenever I need to concentrate, I'll come down here and sit at this table and just think. And you kind of sometimes I get more involved in thinking about what's around me.
Oh, that's easy to do.
Yeah, than what I'm supposed to be working on.
Yeah.
So think about the old stone house was not just a house that sat out in the wilderness. So we've already established there were the cutting of the trees back from around the house was probably a way to kind of return it back to the way it probably once more looked.
Oh, yes. We're clearly moving in the direction of what it really looked like.
Yeah. And then, but as well, the old stone house was a plantation.
Mm-hmm.
So we are looking at really a place of like a commercial farm in the 1700s, and more than likely one that was of significant size.
Well, I think you can easily go back again to Governor Dobbs and his letter where he talks about 1747. He came here and visited about the same time that the Brons are coming. And he said very clearly that the Germans were thrifty and industrious. He particularly thought that they made very good cheese and very good butter. And he made the point that they were taking their products to Charleston, or Charlestown as it was called back then. And I think the Brons would have been part of that, given that the Brons end up being among the most prosperous people very quickly, and given their link to wagon making.
Of course.
Given that skill set, you have to assume that not everybody came here with a wagon, but they could build a wagon. That blacksmiths, ironmongers, all the various sources which led to these kind of skills, that Michael Braun had a skill set that made him, in a sense, quickly become one of the more prosperous Germans around. Now that fits my thesis, I think, if you think about it. And that is, he wouldn't have stopped here. He might have gone on to South Carolina, where there were other German settlements, where he would have been closer to the river port of Augusta, where he could have gotten to Charleston a lot easier, and he might have just gone on down there. But for some reason, people like him stopped here because of this confluence, if you will, of resources and potential. And although we have to assume this house stood out even back then, we have to also believe that there were a lot of people who built the kind of substantial houses that were similar to this. They just might not have been of stone. Gotcha. We do have that to think about.
Gotcha. Well, and when we talk about the plantation house, you can't really escape the fact that there were enslaved people who worked here. And in fact, in 1790, there were as many as 15 working here, which you've recently completed that study for St. Luke's. In 1790, 15 slaves in Rowan County, that's no small number of people.
That puts you in the upper 1%.
Yes.
Because there weren't that many people who had that many slaves. And let's even pretend, since we know the names I've forgotten.
We have Emily and Betsy are two mixed race slaves who lived here.
Okay. Well, we have to assume that, especially given we have the 1768 tax list, there was only one person, and that was John Frohock, who actually, or the Frohock family, who owned a substantial number of slaves. But there was a wide distribution of slave holding, particularly among the Scots-Irish. If you go over to where Mount Morn and Mooresville are today, as many as 30 to 40% of them own one or two. And that was always the case that Germans generally owned fewer, but what you found among the more prosperous Germans is that one of their investments were in human beings. And there's no reason to suggest or to deny that soon after 1766, he's beginning to invest in them. In a sense, the number 15 for our first census that we have data is really more an accumulation. Plus, we don't know from year to year how they went up and down. We don't have records of the sales. We don't have records of the buying. None of that exists for us, quite frankly, for any German that we have. But we know that the prosperous Germans, and that would be the Pfeiffers and Cabarrus, my ancestor, and some of the folks who are listening, John Lippard, who owned 1813 and 1800, that, and particularly the Berengers, who were, in a sense, comparable to the Browns here in Rowan, and the Browns and what become the biggest German slave owners of the 1800s, the Heiligs. You see, all of them are investing in small numbers of slaves that would have helped make the self-sufficiency of the places of plantation more viable, more doable.
One thing that I often tell school groups that I have here, we're standing in front of the gigantic fireplace, one of the biggest fireplaces you can see. I mean,
only seen one comparable to it.
Yeah, and we have the oven outside now. I mean, it would have been up to the female slaves who had been preparing the food here where we sit to cook food for like close to 20, 30 people a day.
Possibly.
And just the amount of a farm that you would have to have for every day to feed that many people, it boggles my mind to think of that amount of work and the storage that they would have had to have for all that food. Yeah.
There's only one house in the greater old Rowan area that I've ever seen a fireplace comparable, and that's an old house that was near Statesville that actually was about the same size as this one. It was not stone, however, it was a brick fireplace. And it had Moravian, Moravian ironwork on the doors.
No.
And I think it dated to the 1780s or maybe the 1770s in that way. And what Aaron's talking about, Aaron, particularly, is this would have, of course, been the equivalent of a multi-burner stove.
Sure.
This is a $5,000 range today with 6 burners on it because you would have been able to do a lot of things.
So, kind of wrapping things up, what distinguished the Browns and the old stone house, Michael Brown's stone house, from the surrounding area?
Well, first you have to think about it from a class point of view. This was an upper class house from the very day it was built. This was a house that represented the best of the American dream that was developing in the colonial period. And it has counterparts. There's a house in Statesville that's about the same age that would have been the American dream to a Scots-Irishman. There are other houses which were built and we have lost, which were made of stone. There is, of course, the Hezekiah Alexander House in Charlotte, which is a smaller version of much the same sort of approach to living. And what distinguished it was its distinction of being Pennsylvania Dutch. That literally what I think we want to understand more than we used to was that Pennsylvania was being transplanted here. That they wanted to do here what had happened to their ancestors and their colleagues in Pennsylvania. And they wanted to have these amazing places to live in. They wanted to have these huge fields. They wanted to have churches which were comparable, and they will eventually do that. We call that Lower Stone and Oregon churches. And I think what we see here that distinguishes it is that it's at the core of a whole area that Rufus Berenger of the famous Berengers once called the Dutch side. And I think that this house today and the pride that the descendants of Michael Brown take in it and the treasure that it is to Rowan County makes it a testimony to the kind of culture that we've perpetuated.
Now, just because there are people watching this around the country who may be descended from Jacob and Abraham, who were living here with Michael, maybe in comparable houses, we really don't know what they had. Did that wanting to recreate Pennsylvania, did that extend out beyond Michael's generation to his children who moved to Illinois, Indiana, places like that? Is that something that we know?
We are beginning to understand that that was true. And I'll use an example from my research across the other river, the Catawba River. And my source there is a man named George Yoder, the primary chronicler of German life over there, talks about the fact that in the 1820s, and see that would be 2 generations down from Michael Brown, that in the 1820s, the young people who were Lutheran and who were of German descent tried very hard to revive their German customs.
No.
We don't know exactly what that meant. It could have meant just keeping Easter Monday. It could have meant the foodways. It could have meant their customs religiously. We're not at all sure what it meant, but he was very adamant that they were very proud of their German heritage. that would indicate perhaps that they were in danger of losing it, that they were in danger of disappearing into the greater culture. The second one comes from my neighborhood at Troutman, where in a recent study I learned that the area I grew up in was still consciously German even through the First World War. And that became part of a study where I realized that the Germans in this area saw themselves as Germans, knew their German heritage, had a sense of it, at least into the 20th century. And I think we lost that for a long time. We kind of assumed by the Civil War all this was gone. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's true. I just think that we're only beginning to understand what that meant on a daily basis.
Did World War One, real quick, did World War I lead to us losing much of our German heritage?
From at least the question that I have from Troutman, where I've looked at it, yes. My particular family held reunions in the 1920s where they made it a big deal to tell the Lutheran pastor to write it up in the paper that they were Americans.
Wow.
And I would have never, ever thought that would have been what they had to say back then.
Wow.
Yes. At the same time, they were serving sauerkraut at the reunion.
Sure. Well, was it freedom cabbage?
Oh, not to them.
Not to them.
Not
Okay.
to them. Not to them. And I suspect anyone who's Brown and Fisher is the same way.
So yeah, what it means to be an American is kind of, that's where our conversation ended up. We started off with Germans, in Rowan County, and then we ended up after World War I with Germans wanting to be American. This has been a great conversation. We hope you've enjoyed it. We'll wrap it up so that way you guys can get on with whatever you need to get on with. And it's been a pretty good way to spend a hurricane, I believe.
I do believe you're right.
Yes.
Thanks to everyone.
Yeah, thank you. See you later.